Hello, good evening, and welcome to the TNT Show. I'm John Drummond, and I'm your host for your 60 exciting minutes ahead. And again, I would just reiterate, we're well on our way to completing 80 shows. 80 shows, and we've had people from right across the political spectrum. We've had people from entertainment. We've had people from various activists, normally folks who don't get a chance to appear for a full hour to talk about the things that they feel are important. That's why it's important that we're here and you can join us tonight. Well, you know, it's been another great day for British democracy. Tory MPs are revolting. No, that's not the end of it. Not because the British Constitution is a mess and their leader has exploited that mess to ruin our institutions, to reward his friends and donors, and to, most recently, deprive pensioners. No. They're revolting because they fear that the many part-time jobs that they have might be at risk. Well. Thanks for joining us this evening. Tonight we'll be talking to award-winning journalist and author Iain Bruce. Now, Iain has also made documentaries for Channel 4 and the BBC. He's an expert on South America, and we'll be talking about those matters and also what he thinks of independence and so much more besides. We'll be talking, obviously, we'll be talking about COP26 because, you know, there's a range of views on whether it's been a success or otherwise. And Iain has an in-depth knowledge of some of the groups that have been involved, and we'll be talking about that in some detail. And you'll be taking your questions live. So if you want to submit a question, go to the What's On Guide at whatsonguide.scot and let us know what your question is, and we'll try and answer it as best you can. So the nation talks. In many respects, the quality and the result of the show is down to you and the quality of the questions. So please let us know. And we're live and we're free. So no license, no problem. You can still enjoy the very best of experts that are around. Okay, so here we are. Tonight, the nation talks to Iain Bruce. Iain, I know you've got a terribly bad cold, so we're absolutely delighted you're soldiering on there. How are you feeling now?
Thank you, John. Yeah, it's a pleasure. I'm really pleased to be able to be with you. I do have a streaming cold, I'm afraid, for the last day or so, but I think we'll manage. I mean, I think it's actually a sign of exhaustion. Essentially, probably it's something that happens to me quite often when I'm really, really tired, because the last 3 weeks or so have been very, very intense during the COP. I had the pleasure and we'll talk a little bit more about this. Really exciting experience to be involved with the COP26 Coalition. That was the umbrella organizing the protests and the People's Summit and all the activities outside the official event. And with a couple of other people, we were producing a daily video summary called Inside Outside for the COP26 Coalition, which was just a sort of 5-minute little mini news program about what had been going on inside the negotiations the day before, and what had been going on outside in the social movements and the protests and People's Summit and so on and so forth, and what was coming up the day ahead. So, it was a great thing to be able to do, but it was very, very tiring. So I think that probably explains why I'm kind of sniffling, and I apologize if I keep, turkey into my hanky and sipping a glass of water.
Please don't worry about it, honestly. Please don't worry about it. We're absolutely delighted that you're able to soldier on. Let me ask you a quick question about COP26. As somebody who has dipped in and dipped out and maybe hasn't paid as much attention as I ought to have done, but of course I've been exposed to mainly what the mainstream media tells me is happening. And their version of facts is that it's been a very mixed outcome. The British government seems to be blaming China and India. I wonder what your assessment is of the proceedings and how you feel things are going to develop in the future as a result of what happened in Glasgow.
I think there are two big things I would want to say about that, John. One is that the negotiations themselves, if you can call them negotiations, fell way, way short of what we need to see in terms of any real concrete, specific commitments to real action, to keep global warming below that critical 1.5 degrees Celsius and all the things involved with that. Very, very poor on that. Although there was a lot of noise, a lot of announcements, of this initiative and that initiative and so on and so forth, as soon as you get into the detail, there's almost nothing concrete there, almost nothing at all, except aspirations, So if you look at those final documents, the two final things that make up the Glasgow Climate Pact, I think you've got, I was counting these up and I should have noted it down. I think there's about 70 something paragraphs, in the main document, 70 points, and they almost all begin with urges, recognizes, stresses, emphasizes, calls upon, and so forth. There are literally 3, I think, of those more than 70 odd paragraphs that say decides. So almost nothing actually kind of concrete decided. So very, very poor on that sense. But the other, and we can go into some of the detail of that in a moment, because, for example, the issue of how it's been framed in a way that blames India and China, I think, is another interesting issue to take up, because that's also quite misleading, I think. But the other big takeaway, I would say, from the COP26 is what happened outside. What happened outside was extraordinary. It was extraordinary. I've been, active in politics and an activist in this country, in Latin America, in different countries where I've lived for many years. I've had the, privilege, I suppose, to be involved and around some fairly intense and big kind of political events, demonstrations, protests, conflicts, and so on and so forth. And I think, what we saw in Glasgow, especially the weekend of the 5th, 6th of November, was really quite extraordinary. I think it was significantly bigger, deeper, broader, more varied, and more dynamic, more radical and interesting than any of us, including who'd been kind of helping to organize it, really expected. So I think that was that and that's so in other words, you have this really, really exciting, dynamic movement, and we have to think, where's that going to do? Is it just going to go up in smoke? Is that the end of it? Or what's going to come out of that? What can come out of it? And on the other hand, this really, really inadequate action by the main governments, especially the UK government, leading the process.
I'm intrigued by what you said there about the problem really wasn't so much about China and India. The problem was maybe wider ranging and maybe deeper than that.
I think the thing that one of the things that I don't think is very little dealt with in the mainstream media, and I think it's important to understand two things actually about which helps you understand the specifics of what is and isn't in that final agreement. One is that when the UN climate negotiations began, way back, and then there was a convention, then the UN FCCC, and then the Kyoto Protocol and so forth. One of the key principles of that whole process was, it's a kind of unwieldy phrase, but it's called shared but differentiated responsibilities. Shared but differentiated responsibilities. What that means is that not all countries in the world can or should be expected to do the same amount at the same speed in order to address the climate crisis. Why? For obvious reasons, because historically we're talking about emissions that have been, put into the atmosphere since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, essentially, and the vast majority of those emissions have been put in the atmosphere by rich industrialized countries in the north, essentially in the north, in Europe, North America, by and large. Now, of course, China and India are huge countries. They're both very big emitters now, but China and China certainly does need to do a lot more. I know from my point of view, I think China does need to do a lot more. But the fact is, China's per capita, China is the biggest emitter in the world, but its per capita emissions are less than half, I think, of the United States, if per head. And of course, if you were to do a sort of historical, how much per head has China emitted over the last 200 years compared with the United States or the UK for that matter, then that comparison would come down even further. And the other thing, of course, to remember is that a very large chunk of China's emissions right now, very huge and worrying emissions, are because China is making half of the things that you and I consume. I mean, so it's not, most of it's not actually Chinese in a sense. It's kind of like our emissions, because all those things you and I buy that were delivered from China, are causing those emissions. So the comparison is not, and that language has been almost stripped out. I mean, sometimes the language is still there, these shared and differentiated responsibilities, but in practice, really, since the Paris Agreement and actually a bit before, that has disappeared. And now the United States and the rich countries are expecting everyone to do the same as them. And that's just not possible or fair, because it's not, they don't have the money, they don't have the technology, and they don't have and they still have, populations suffering considerable amounts of poverty. So there has to be a different speed and a different scale of action. Everyone needs to act, but the scale and speed of action has to be different. And that was left out. So that's why India particularly, objected to we have to phase out coal. They do need to phase out coal. But, the fact is that wasn't accompanied by a recognition that they can't phase out coal quite as quickly as, the US or Poland or other European countries, for example.
Do you think, Iain, they were set up in that regard?
Absolutely. I'm sure. Yeah, no, I think the whole thing was, to some extent, I don't want to get into conspiracy theories here, I mean, you can say it's, to what extent it's a deliberate plan, and to what extent it's a kind of inevitable outcome of the way people think about things and behave, But the fact is, it was set up because that different responsibilities, that sort of, and the equity between poor countries in the south and rich countries in the north has largely gone from the climate negotiations. It was set up to be able to blame, the bigger countries of the south. I'm just losing my picture here. I'm just wondering why that is. So I'm just going to try and, I wonder if you come back again. There you are. Yeah, I'm sorry. I apologize. I lost you.
No problem.
So I think that's an important thing to understand. And the other thing that's quickly, I think, which is important to understand in these negotiations, is that, in the earlier days, the Kyoto, for example, the Kyoto Accord was binding. It was stipulating what countries needed to do to address the problem. Yeah. So that, again, by the time it got to Paris, that binding agreements and treaties have been replaced by voluntary contributions. So we had a lot of these nationally determined contributions, NDCs, which is actually the only thing that was really important. No, the most important thing about Glasgow was that by the Glasgow COP, all the countries were meant to have arrived with their new, bigger promises, their bigger commitments, nationally determined. But there's nothing that actually obliges anybody to do anything there. Each country comes and offers what it can, or what it wants to. And so there's no binding framework. And in the view of some climate campaigners, has actually even now been further eroded, because actually what came down to this COP was essentially announcements. There was really not much negotiating going on those big questions at all. It was just, the UK government announces that 100 countries have decided to save the forests by 2030, or to, reduce investments in coal overseas, and so on. Oh, those big announcements, which again had very little teeth in them. They were essentially kind of PR exercises rather than real concrete negotiated agreements to do concrete things.
Well, I mean, that's been my experience, that the difference between PR and actually doing something is if you're going to be measured on it.
Exactly.
There's no point in making a commitment which you don't mean. And the way you can tell the people who mean things and the people who don't mean things is the people who mean things actually say, and this is the way you can measure my performance here. And that moves it away from being PR onto some moral and ethical plane, because we can all share in that process of checking, because there's transparency involved, and there's which underpins the commitment. And I do worry. Do you think? I mean, what do you think of the UK's stewardship of COP26?
Oh, I mean, the first days was chaos outside just to get into the COP was total chaos, with huge queues and delegates and people not being able to get in time for their meetings and so on and so forth. And I think that was just a sort of sample of what had been really very poor preparation. I mean, admittedly, of course, it's, the whole situation of the pandemic certainly made things a lot more complicated. It wasn't easy. Nobody should suggest it was. But, the fact is that in the end, large numbers of delegations, especially civil society delegations from the global south, just couldn't get to Glasgow. For example, we've had a close relationship with an indigenous leader in Ecuador called Leonie de Siso, who's a very impressive guy. I mean, and I was, because I was living in Ecuador until quite recently, and moved back to Glasgow in the middle of the pandemic. That was one of the relationships. So he's taken part, for example, in a number of the pre-COP events that we organized from the COP26 Coalition. We were really keen to get him as one of the sort of, and he's a significant guy in Latin America. He was one of the leaders of the October uprising in 2019 in Ecuador. Very, very impressive young indigenous leader. And, he was one of the people we would have liked to have been one of the figureheads of the sort of indigenous delegations and on the march on the 6th of November and so on and so forth. But he couldn't get to Glasgow. Impossible, because Ecuador was still on the red list, because he didn't qualify for one of the official delegations, which meant that he would have had to spend, at least right up until the end. Of course, they lifted the red list a few days before, but that was far too late. He would have had to spend 20 days basically traveling, in different forms of quarantine in order to get to Glasgow at all. So it was completely impossible. So that's just an example, and that was not a unique case at all. A lot of people who would have liked to go to Glasgow didn't get to Glasgow. That said, there was a really exciting representation of people from around the world, African delegates, Latin American delegates, and so on and so forth. It was, in that sense, it was still a very exciting time.
And you mentioned that the broadcast, or the material that you produced on a daily basis, is that available anywhere? I mean,
yes, of course. Yeah, no, absolutely. Yes, no, and I would encourage, be great if people can have a look at it. I mean, it's on the COP26 Coalition YouTube page, on the Facebook page. It's actually the channel, the Latin American news channel I used to work at called Telesur has a channel in English. They've been broadcasting it too, so it'll be on their page. I think there are short links to it on the coalition's Twitter and Instagram and so forth as well. Yeah,
good. So, you mentioned to me off air a Brazilian group called Media Ninja.
Yes, that was a really exciting. That was a really exciting and innovative thing, which in a way took me back to some of my roots. Because I think my own history is a little bit odd, I suppose, in the sense that I've spent kind of half of my professional life working in mainstream media, television news, BBC, Al Jazeera, that kind of stuff. But I spent another half of my life in sort of alternative media, independent media, community media, activist media, and stuff like that. So that I'm sort of I've always sort of straddled a little bit of those two worlds, So it was very exciting for me to, in a way, reconnect with those kind of like alternative media roots when we got in touch with a Brazilian group called Media Ninja, who they'd done brilliant stuff around big social movements and the indigenous camps in Brasilia over the years, and various other actions, where they essentially it's a kind of really, really simple idea, which they call collective coverage. So you go to any of these big events or a big protest or a big march, whatever, and there are dozens of people taking photographs, filming it. Some of them are just individuals for their personal interest, but a lot of them are sort of involved, you know, they're actually doing some publicity for this movement, that organization. They want to put it on their webpage, they want to publicize the event or whatever, you know. So the idea is, well, okay, so instead of just all these people doing their own little thing, let's try and find a space where we can bring all these people into the same space. So we're going to create one big Telegram channel, because Telegram, you can upload an almost infinite amount of video and photos to a Telegram channel. We invite all these people into this Telegram channel. There's a few very simple, basic groundwork rules. So, you know, you agree to let your stuff be used as on a Creative Commons basis and so on and so forth. And then all that material is there, available for anybody to use. So, you know, for example, our daily broadcast, we were out shooting our stuff ourselves, of course, that we specifically wanted. But, you know, there was so much going on. We couldn't possibly have been running around Glasgow covering every interesting thing. And then something really interesting happened that we didn't know about, like, you know, the climate camp Scotland people had been down on the picket lines with the GMB bin strikers. You know, we didn't know that was happening. And that was a really strong image of, you know, climate activists getting together with the cleansing workers in Glasgow who are on strike, you know, and both vowing to kind of support each other. And actually, that's another interesting. I mean, that was an inspiring moment too. On the Fridays for Future demonstration on the Friday, I've never seen so many GMB flags on a climate demonstration. I mean, you know, how does that happen? You know, that was, you know, so yeah. So anyway, go back. So this Media Ninja inspired kind of alternative media space called collective coverage was great. You know, there was just this like a flurry of activity and material available for people to use as they wanted.
Now,
so I think that's something we should think about in the future, you know, in terms of how to build, you know, an alternative media space, you know.
Well, I think a lot of people would love to see an alternative media space, because a lot of the people who come on this show deplore the fact that the mainstream media has become, I'm searching for a kind way to put it, tabloidized. You know, in other words, if it bleeds, it leads. You have to be able to express even the most complicated idea in 3 minutes, and your time's up, and you're back out in the street. What we're doing just now never happens. It never happens. You know, the experts appear, and you no longer have you keyed into their voice, and they're gone, and they're replaced by some person who knows nothing about the subject, who pontificates for 5 minutes, and you think, this is nuts. It's the wrong way around. So, how easy or difficult would it be to replicate that? Could you have a Scottish ninja?
Totally, absolutely. I mean, we did work with. I mean, there were people from whatever. There were people from different countries and different parts of from England as well as Scotland and so forth in this Media Ninja space, in this collective coverage space. But there were certainly a number of Scottish media producers, creators, activists, and several others who were around the edges of it, sort of dipping in and out. I think we should certainly try and link up with those people like Scotia Media, for example, some group of young media activists who are doing stuff around independence mainly, who are helping us produce our daily show. You know, and I'm sure there's loads and loads of people out there who I think we should think about how we could build a space. And obviously the independence movement is one kind of, you know, point around which I think some of those movements will come together. I mean, I think that's another big thing, which, I mean, for me, the COP26 experience raises some really, really interesting questions, and I don't have answers to them. I'm not sure anybody has answers to them yet, but I think they're questions we need to ask. And that's one of them. You know, how could we develop and replicate an alternative media space? Should it be around independence? Should it be around climate? Should it be around the two things together? You know, but that goes for the climate movement itself. You know, I mean, where did those 100,000 people, or maybe it was 150,000 people on the streets of Glasgow come from? You know, who were they? You know, I mean, I don't. You know, maybe you have a better idea than I do. I don't. I mean, you know, maybe 5,000 of them were sort of like regular climate justice activists. You know. Maybe 5,000 or 10,000 were these international activists who come to Glasgow for the COP, but that still leaves a huge majority who, and you know, I suppose there were, you know, maybe another 5,000 who were the organised left in some sense, you know, the political left or of some sort. but that still leaves a huge majority who weren't any of those things, who were out on the streets because they were concerned about the issues, and that's a force, a strength, that we need to work out how we can address. How can we keep that? Did they bother to go out on Saturday for nothing? Or can we build on that? And can we bring that together? And does it need, and should it be, because there wasn't independent, there were lots of those, there were thousands and thousands of saltires on that march, I mean, it was, doesn't necessarily mean there were some of them there was an independence block on the march, which was not insignificant. But, I think that convergence between the independence movement and the climate movement is another really exciting space, which again raises lots of big questions for me. And I think we need to explore,
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, maybe there's somebody watching and listening tonight who thinks, something, I've got the answer to this. And if you have the answer, let us know. Because, the terrific thing is we're now in an age where it is possible, like we're doing just now, to reach loads and loads of people. There's a potential is there. How you exploit that, how you finance it, how you do all these things, maybe is less of an issue than it once was. I want to take a couple of questions, if I may, just very quickly, and we'll come back to the very interesting points you're making in a second, Iain. Mike Fennick is asking, the UK now holds the presidency of COP for the next roughly 12 months, I suppose. Do you think they'll achieve very much?
Short answer, no. Unfortunately. I mean, I think it's a difficult one. We have to keep up the pressure. We have to demand accountability. They've promised, they claim they're keeping 1.5 alive, as they put it, i.e. that they're still committed to taking the action necessary to prevent global warming rising by more than 1.5 degrees Celsius, which kind of everyone agrees is the critical point beyond which things become really, really, really dangerous. Although for many they're dangerous already, of course. So we do need to keep putting that pressure on to hold them to account. And I think, Nicola Sturgeon's announcement last night, or not announcement, sorry, her response, I think it was to a question, where for the first time she came out and said, no, Cambo should not go ahead. There's no way that you can develop the Cambo oil field and have that in line with a target of 1.5 degrees maximum global warming. That's really important. And that must have, because the Scottish government hasn't taken that position before. She hasn't taken that position before, not publicly anyway. And that's really important. I think she's responding to the mood to some extent, She's responding, to what's been going on in Glasgow for the last couple of weeks. But the UK government, I think it's going to be a lot more difficult to get some serious concrete action out of them. I mean, we have to push for it. We have to demand it. Every little bit of action is, a little bit of action in the right direction because the stakes are so high. But I think there's another big strategic question here is, what does the climate movement do? Do we just keep on demanding that they do things that they're not doing, and then they don't do them, and they won't do them, and we keep demanding it? How does that go on forever? Some people are saying, no, we just forget about the COPs, forget about, we have to, almost do it ourselves, kind of thing, and close down the fossil fuel industry or whatever. I think that's not realistic myself, I don't see how that could happen. But it is complicated.
Maybe it's multifaceted. Maybe that's the answer. Like most things are, there's not necessarily one silver bullet that does it. You have to do a variety of things. And what's interesting, Susan Dyer is saying, I was there with Extinction and there were large contingencies from Wales, Cornwall, as well as London. So that speaks to your point that people are energized. They want to see something happen. Now, in the absence of things happening, the human condition suggests that one or two alternatives are generated. One is that people become intensely apathetic and just opt out. The other alternative is people say, well, the system is failing me. So we have to come up with a different system, one that actually is responsive to people's concerns and needs. I think one of the worrying things that I saw in the last couple of days in the financial pages was the decision of Shell to locate to London, because as you know, Shell is based in The Hague, but its ownership is, I guess you could say, it's a sort of, they call themselves Anglo-Dutch, so it's a Dutch-British entity, and very often the chairman is either British for a period, then it's Dutch, or I don't think they've ever had a woman chair, and I hope I'm not doing them a disservice. But the rationale, apparently, in moving to London is because London is now, the UK is now outside of Brexit, because of Brexit, is outside of the European climate requirements. And if that is the case, sounds to me like very bad news indeed, because it's going in the opposite direction to the one that you suggested, which is that people should be aiming for a more sustainable future. If their reaction to pressure is to say, no, I want to go and hide away, and I've found places I can hide more effectively, then that's definitely not a good sign if that's the case.
No, I mean, I don't think we could or should. I mean, some of the oil companies, many of the oil companies, claim to have net zero targets and all this kind of stuff. I mean, we could talk about net zero anyway, which is a very problematic concept anyway. Net zero. I won't necessarily bore you all with that right now. But the point is, we can't depend on oil companies to do, to get rid of oil. That's by definition, I mean, the Scottish government has to take action. It has to. And I know it's a difficult issue, but it's perfectly possible. It's perfectly possible to decommission North Sea oil in the next 10 years. It's the only way it can be done, and it has to be done with the oil workers, with all those people who are employed in and around the oil industry. Having their say, taking part in the process, helping to design the alternatives. But all those jobs that any number of jobs we need to replace the jobs we don't need. And it's not just moving from an oil rig to a wind farm kind of thing. There might be a little bit of that, but it's just rethinking about what our priorities are. In terms of public transport, in terms of healthcare, in terms of all those things that require more work, more effort, and eliminating the things that we really don't need and can't have. If we're going to keep a sustainable planet.
Richard Halligan has asked, would you not agree that after all the COP summits that perhaps the smaller nations in the world should start trying to get their own legally binding commitments to keep 1.5 alive? And I was just, forget the big players for the time being. I'm not suggesting he's saying only do that. Maybe that's...
Yeah, I mean, I think it could be. I don't know. I mean, maybe that's an interesting... I mean, it would be symbolic, of symbolic value mainly, I suppose, because, carbon emissions by definition, don't respect borders. They're just up there. So obviously, a bunch of small nations are not on their own going to tip the balance sufficiently. But they could certainly have an important symbolic thing. Again, it was a tiny amount of money, but it was kind of interesting and symbolic that the Scottish government was the first to offer, I think it was just £1 million or something, which is nothing, of course, to start up what they call loss and damage fund. That's one of the loss and damage is the money that countries in the global south have been demanding for years and years and years, and which this COP was the US just sat on it and said no. But this is money this is not the finance to help them adapt to climate change. That's to say, there's a huge amount of money that's needed for poorer countries to develop the technologies and the energy systems that will enable them to contribute to deal with climate change in the future. But the loss and damage is specifically about coping with the damage already done, already being done. So, in the most obvious instances, if you've been a small Caribbean island that's basically had 90% of your infrastructure destroyed by a hurricane, as happened, a couple of years ago in Dominica and Antigua and Barbuda, who's going to pay for that? The scale and the ferocity of the hurricanes is clearly now established. That you can't tie each individual hurricane, but we know that climate change is responsible for the greater frequency and intensity of such events. So, you know, you're not responsible for that. You know, those islands didn't contributed almost nothing to the carbon emissions and global warming that have intensified those hurricanes, but they're the ones who are having 90% of their infrastructure destroyed by it. You know, so that's a responsibility, you know, that the rich countries have to deal with. You know, they haven't addressed it at all in this COP at all. And at least the Scottish government did try to kind of like set the ball rolling by offering £1 million, the first country to offer £1 million or dollars, I'm not sure which, in that direction. So, you know, there's these little things, small countries can take symbolic steps, you know, and those symbolic steps can be important, you know. And yeah, we should certainly encourage those, you know. But, you know, the Scottish government's got a long way to go, I think. You know, the Scottish government has to separate itself from the vested interests in oil and fossil fuels, you know, and it hasn't really done that yet, I don't think. I think
does it have the power not to license?
Well, no, that's the other thing, of course. No, and that's of course brings us back to the independence question. You know, no. Ultimately, Nicola Sturgeon and the Scottish government will not decide whether Canberra goes ahead. You know, it's not their remit. You know, the UK government will decide. I imagine the Scottish government could make it quite difficult for it to go ahead if it wanted to be, you know, if it wanted to obstruct it. I imagine there are various things it could do to make it quite difficult. But in theory, the UK government has those powers. Yeah,
I have a feeling that the opportunity to obstruct the UK government has gone with the recent legislation that's gone through Westminster, internal market, all of that good stuff. That's all aimed at removing any possibility even that this sub-national groups can interfere with the decisions taken at Westminster. I mean, I don't think it was aimed at this particular license, but it was perhaps aimed at making it much easier to sell off the NHS. Because if you can say to prospective purchasers, look, it doesn't matter what these people say, the Scottish NHS will be up for sale along with all the other parts of it, or rather the bits that you want to buy, Mr. Vulture Fund. And don't worry your head about Nicola Sturgeon, because if she steps out of line, believe me, we've got measures that we can apply to bring her back into line. And, you know, I suppose that's the reality of it, is that, and that brings us back to the point about independence, because a lot of people, I suspect many watching and listening, will be thinking, well, as each day goes past, and each month goes past, our climate change issues they're increasing, they're getting worse. You know, why doesn't the Scottish government take some concrete steps to bring independence closer, or at least a referendum closer, so that people can make a choice? What's your take on that?
I mean, I'm absolutely in favour of a referendum. I mean, of course, we need to have a referendum when we can win it, you know. So, and there's obviously some complicated tactical issues there. You know, what percentage do we think we need in the opinion polls before it's safe to hold a referendum? You know, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm guessing we would want to see a clear 60% in favour of independence before it would feel comfortable to go for another referendum, I'm guessing. But I mean, in the meantime, I think there are still things that the Scottish government does have certain powers, and while we're campaigning in that direction, I think on the one hand, we need to build up the civil society movement. As I said before, this kind of conjunction between the independence movement and the climate justice movement, I think it's a really interesting area to look at. And we need to push the Scottish government to do things that it can do now, you know, and I think there are quite a lot of things it can do on, you know, transport and housing, you know, heating, all the kinds of things that, you know, we know need to be done. It's not rocket science, you know. Yeah. We know a lot of things that need to be done. And, you know, there are a lot of groups in Scotland that have done serious work on this, you know. in terms of what a Scottish Green New Deal, if you like, would look like, in quite a lot of detail. Some of that work has been done. I'm not saying it doesn't. I'm sure it needs to be developed further and so on and so forth. But it's not. As I say, we kind of know what needs to be done, but we need the political will to do it. And I'm not sure the Scottish government always has that political will. It needs to be pushed. It needs to be pushed a lot harder.
Do you think they think the fact that there are now Green ministers makes a difference?
I hope so. Yes, I think it could do. There's always a two-edged thing there, I think, because will the Green ministers push the government further in the right direction, or will the Green ministers be pulled in the wrong direction?
We're dealing with politicians.
Yeah. But no, I think it's potentially positive, definitely. I think Patrick Harvey said yesterday that COP26 was a failure. That's clear, but our job remains the same. We know what needs to be done. We can start doing something in Scotland.
I suppose a cynic would say, well, anything that Boris Johnson turns his hand to is bound almost to be a failure, because he doesn't care, except when it comes to rewarding his friends, as I said at the beginning, or channeling money to various donors, etc. I'd like to talk, if we can, a little bit about your time in South and Latin America. Are there any lessons that you think Scotland could learn from your experiences in those countries?
Gosh, well, two things come to mind. One relates immediately to what we were just talking about, the COP thing. So one of the Ecuadorian indigenous representatives who was in Glasgow this last week and who spoke at one of the sessions of the People's Summit said something which I thought was quite interesting. He said, we really need, there are these different kind of spaces emerging in different circumstances in different parts of the world. He cited the example in Ecuador, which I was a little bit involved in myself when we were living in Ecuador, and was a very inspiring experience, which was that uprising, indigenous-led uprising against neoliberal policies and cuts and layoffs in public and privatizations and so on and so forth in October 2019, which was a real, I think it's the one time in my life I could say, as I said, I've been in quite a few interesting situations of this sort, but I think that's the one time in my life where I felt this feels like what an insurrection must feel like. This feels like an entire people just, we've had enough. We are going to, take over this space, and we are going to change things. Of course, it lasted for a week or something. It wasn't whatever. It achieved some things, but anyway, it was a very inspiring space. And what came out of that, and this is what he was saying last week here in Glasgow, was a thing what they called the Parliament of the People. So they got together out of that. They'd actually won an immediate victory. They got what they wanted from the government in terms of their immediate demands. And they got, I think, 180 different social movements, organizations, trade unions, indigenous organizations, women's organizations, and so on and so forth, together over a period of about 4 or 5, 6 days initially, talking really intensively. And they came up with an alternative platform of what they thought should be done, instead of what the government's kind of neoliberal package of austerity measures was. And that's continuing. That process is continuing, that People's Parliament, as they call it. So he says, look, we had this experience, There were the big demonstrations in Chile. They developed similar kinds of organizations and spaces. In Colombia, too. And here in the UK, he said, you've got this COP26 Coalition, which is bringing together all these social movements around climate justice and around the holding of the COP. What we need is somehow for these spaces, which are different in different parts of the world, to connect up, and build some kind of common space to kind of work out some international positions on these things, some international coordination and demands and proposals and so on and so forth. So that was kind of interesting. I mean, it may sound a little bit utopian, but maybe not.
Oh,
maybe not. I mean, maybe, why not? Why not?
Why not? You could argue that the United Nations sounded a bit utopian on stage. And here we are. Which brings me on.
And one other, if I can just jump back a lot further back in my Latin American experience, because I think this is also an interesting one that also connects a little bit with the climate movement now, is that back at let's see how far, almost 20 years ago, I did some work in Brazil on. It has a very inelegant kind of title called participatory budgets, which sounds pretty awful, but actually it's a really, really interesting idea, which was basically some left-wing parties, won the mayoral elections in some biggish cities in the south of Brazil, and they basically began to organize what they called a participatory budget, which meant, essentially, in its most radical version, was, right, this is the money that we have to spend. We're going to ask people what we should spend it on. So they had this very elaborate, very efficient, and very elaborate scheme of, local meetings, local assemblies, which kind of combined in different levels to discuss priorities. And there was a whole system for voting on priorities and assigning a kind of hierarchy to priorities, of whether you thought more should be spent on schools or on road improvements or on a whole series of different things. And this was translated into essentially a budget, the budget priorities for the city council. Now it's a kind of a little bit like, but I think actually much more interesting and more radical in a sense than the kind of thing that Extinction Rebellion talk a lot about people's assemblies, which are not uninteresting, but they're not quite the same. People's assemblies are sort of, you select, if I understand them correctly, you select a kind of random sample of the population, and the Glasgow City Council did this actually, this is something similar a few months ago on the climate changes. You select around and then you ask them, what they think we should do and so forth. But that's doesn't involve the whole population. It's just this random sample. And B, it doesn't actually decide anything, doesn't have any, whereas this experiment in southern Brazil had real decision-making power. It actually decided what the money was going to be spent on. And it was open to everybody. So now I think that's a really, really interesting experience. I mean, things went wrong, and you can the whole history about, why it didn't develop in the way you might have wanted it. But for several years, it was really, really interesting. And I wrote a little book about it. And I think, if we're talking about council elections in Glasgow next year, in Scotland next year, and for example, I've heard Fridays for Future people, the youth strike people, talking about having climate justice candidates in Scotland in next year's local elections, which sounds to me at least an interesting idea, worth considering. Maybe we can draw together some of these strands, maybe we can draw together and actually develop some more radical proposals for actually how local government could be reshaped to actually address people's needs in a more really radically democratic way and actually allow people to decide what they need, what they want.
I think it would have to be through that sort of process that any reshaping of local government took place, because, my experience of local government is very mixed. I'm trying to be kind here. But and it could easily be changed for the better. Somebody once told me, I hope this story is not true, that the reason we have the number of local authorities in Scotland that we do was down to a Tory Secretary of State. So this goes back some years, because there hasn't been a Tory in power in Scotland. A secretary, well, certainly not in terms of, obviously there wasn't a Scottish government around or a parliament at that time. And he was given options about, should we have 48, should we have 20, whatever. And he ended up saying, well, 31. Somebody said, what about 31? He said, I'll settle for that, because we've been talking too long. And so there was no rationale to it, really. That was the version I was given. It was just somebody who was getting tired, getting fed up, and said 31 sounds like a good number. And that's why we ended up where we ended up. You'd have to think that any form of participative process would have come up with a more rational result than that, if that story is true. And it strikes me a lot of the decisions that politicians take, by their very nature, trying to balance the views of interest groups, whether they're seen or unseen. It produces very odd results sometimes, which jar with the local authority or the local communities sometimes. So there might be scope for two things. One is candidates at the next council elections, and also at the same time going down the route of the participative budget as well, because they wouldn't necessarily have to be exclusive, I should imagine.
No, not at all. I mean, the whole idea of participatory budget is that it's not along party. It's it has to be open to everybody. It's kind of, it has to be cross-party. It has to be universal suffrage, as it were. It has to be a process that anyone can and everyone can take part in.
Because the reality is that the present politics is not working for lots of people. People, I suspect, despair when they look at the House of Lords, for example, and think, well, we're paying for all of this. Looking at it from the outside, it must look bizarre that you've got this 800-strong entity, which is the only mechanism that exercises any moderation over the executive. Otherwise, they can do pretty much what they like. What's your book called, by the way? Is it Progressive Politics of Latin America? Have I got that right?
No, the one on the participatory budget is called the Porto Alegre Experience.
The Porto Alegre, and the publishers. Do you recall?
It's Pluto Press.
Pluto, okay.
Yeah, and the one on Venezuela is called The Real Venezuela, which is also Pluto Press.
Yeah. I was rushing ahead there. I think you were saying that the book you're working on now might well have a title about the book I was hoping to work on, I've kind of put on one side because I've been busy with COP and because of the pandemic, because I need to do some more field work. But it's essentially about the kind of crossover between indigenous movements and the often very conflictive crossover between indigenous movements and progressive governments claim to be socialism in the 21st century in Latin America, and what that could teach us about, I suppose, an eco-socialist. I guess I would call myself an eco-socialist, although I guess that can mean lots of things to different people. But what that experience of those two crossover, converging and sometimes contradicting movements of progressive governments and indigenous movements can teach us about what a kind of eco-socialist alternative might look like, not just in Latin America, but around the place. Yeah. So that's the aim, yeah. But it needs a lot of, almost all my books have, because I suppose I'm a journalist, not an academic really by trade. So they've all been based a lot. They try to deal with some ideas that seem to me important and sort of develop those ideas. But they almost always start from, a lot of interviews with people on the ground, what people actually say about whatever it is they've been doing or what's happening, and trying to pull together the material from those interviews into some kind of analysis of whatever the issues are. So that's the kind of thing I'd like to do again. Yeah. But I need to go back and spend a few months doing some new interviews on the ground. Are there any lessons we can learn from Uruguay? Because I gather at one point they had a president who scorned official office trappings and lived at home in a cottage.
Mojica. Well, he was certainly a very, very appealing character. Curiously, he didn't really change that much. He passed some very interesting, socially liberal, if you like, legislation on gender rights and on legalizing cannabis and those sort of social issues. But I think he didn't feel he was in a position to kind of challenge the economic powers that be, basically. So he was actually quite moderate in terms of addressing the sort of economic structures and so on and so forth. But he was a very interesting guy. I interviewed him once. Yeah, he was. I interviewed him before he was president, when he was a senator, and he called me out to his house, which was outside Montevideo, and it was literally, it was like a shack on a little kind of farm with a beaten up old Volkswagen Beetle outside, and that was his car, and he was already, he was a prominent senator at that time. But he lived in this really, really modest house and drove this kind of, and apparently I didn't never actually met him again once he was president, but apparently he continued to drive his beaten up Beetle and live in the same shack when he was, when he wasn't in the and avoided the presidential palace when he was in the presidency. No, he was a very likable and interesting guy.
Yeah, it sounds like an interesting guy.
He'd be, decades before he'd been an urban guerrilla, and against the military dictatorship, and spent many years in prison as a result.
Fascinating, absolutely fascinating. If you were to look at the countries in Latin America that you're familiar with, which would you say, hey, this is a place with a really interesting and different future that might lie ahead?
Oh, I mean, it's an area of the world that I love and spent a long time there, and feel very close to. So, and they have different contributions, I think, from different parts. But just in terms of the scale, I suppose Brazil is probably the country which has the most vibrant and varied social movements, ranging from, the trade union movements and the women's movement to the, the indigenous movements and the peasant movement, the landless movement, very impressive. I mean, the landless movement in Brazil, for example, I think are the pioneers, can teach us so much about how we should be producing and consuming food, not just in Brazil, but around the world, again, something which could be totally applicable in Scotland, in terms of, really different food system for eating healthy and sustainably produced food without flying things across the globe unnecessarily, so
somebody tells me that the present system in the UK is sort of, it works oblivious to the cost, environmental cost. I mean, somebody once told me, again, I hope this isn't true, that a packet of biscuits typically made in Edinburgh is shipped to Milton Keynes, where there's a distribution centre, and then shipped all the way back to Glasgow.
Wouldn't surprise me at all. Wouldn't surprise me at all. No, I mean, that I would think was a fairly minor example. I think you often have similar things happening across continents,
Yeah.
But yeah, no, totally irrational,
Well, Iain, this has been great. We're almost coming to the end of our time. Are there any messages you'd like to leave with people tonight? Maybe something we haven't covered that you feel, hey, I really would like to make this point before I go.
No, I think, it's been a strange time for me moving to Scotland in the middle of the pandemic. I mean, I knew that there were interesting things going on in Scotland. It was one of the reasons I wanted to come here. My family had Scottish roots a long time ago, but I'd never lived in Scotland. And I was excited to move. And the COP, of course, was one of the things that the center of that attraction too. But I think this is a special moment. Maybe I'm sorry, it's not a new thing. I'm kind of repeating what I said before. I think what's happened over the last few weeks in Glasgow shows to me that there is an extraordinary potential in Scotland for doing things and building something, and I don't know what it is quite, and I'm looking for, I think we all need to be looking to each other to find out what that is, but we desperately need to do it. It would be tragic. It would be tragic to let that slip, and just say, oh well, there was a big demonstration in Glasgow on the 6th of November 2021. You tell my children about it.
Yeah.
But I think it's a moment which we need to seize upon, and I do think that kind of connection between climate and independence is somehow the area to me where it's going to kind of gel to come together.
Good. Well, that's It's good to know. And it's and like everything tonight, what you've said has been enormously interesting, and from my point of view, educational as well. Last week we had Julian Caldecott, and he talked about the methane release problems in the Arctic Ocean and stuff like that. So what you've been talking about tonight resonates very neatly with that. And I hope people watching and listening will take that message. It does seem to me that the way forward lies in our own hands. I'm not sure we can honestly depend on the institutions to pick this up and run with it. I think the 150,000 people you mentioned are the place where that's going to happen. Like you, I'm not clear about how that will manifest itself, but it seems to me it's more likely to come from that quarter than from the established arrangements. So again, thank you very much, Iain. It's been terrific. And a big thank you to all of you out there for joining us tonight. As ever, we've got some very interesting guests lined up for future shows. We're back next week at the same time with another special guest. Professor Donald Christie is here next Wednesday. Come and join us, please, at 7 p.m. And as always, look out for the Constitution column in the Sunday National this weekend. I gather part of the paper has been reformatted, so it might be easier to find in the 7-day supplement. If you like it, tell the editor. And thanks again. And I do hope you found the whole programme tonight as enjoyable as I have. Please join us next Wednesday. And remember, it's been a great day for British democracy. Global Britain has become global sleaze. So to all of you, thanks for joining us. Stay safe, take care, and see you next week. And by the way, please look out for the Scotonomics show, which is starting right after this show. See you next week. Take care, and please stay safe.